What I know about my own sexual acting out was that I had an experience as a child 50 years ago where my parents punished me in a way that today would be considered child abuse. And I had a lot of confusion and humiliation around it, which I swallowed. And they came back up in a sexualized form. And that has been the driver of my sexual addiction this whole time.
Welcome to Psychedelic in Recovery Integration Radio, a safe space where PIR, also known as Persons in Recovery, come and share their experience, strengths, and hope with you. My name is Anne. I'm a person in recovery and your host today. Integration Radio is a podcast by Psychedelics in Recovery. The views shared are personal and do not represent PIR as a whole. PIR does not promote, endorse, or sell psychedelics or any substances. This podcast is for reflection and integration only and is not medical or professional advice. We ask listeners to respect anonymity and the principles of recovery. Please see the safety and ethics page on our website for additional resources, psychedelicsinrecovery.org. This radio is part of PIR's ongoing effort to carry the message of recovery to those still suffering. In alignment with the 12 traditions that guide our fellowship, this program will not be funded by outside contribution. PIR, as an organization, has no opinion on outside issues. While we discuss plant medicine and psychedelics in this episode, PIR does not promote or endorse their use. The spiritual intention of PIR and of this broadcast is to create diverse, safe, and sacred spaces for all who wish to recover, always striving for humility over hubris and principles before personalities. Whether you're new to the idea of integrating psychedelics or plant medicine in your recovery process, new to recovery or a long-time member of the fellowship, our aim is to create a space of curiosity, connection, and hope. In this first series, entitled Journeys of Healing, we explore the intersection of recovery and the transformative potential of psychedelic medicine through some of our members' experience. So settle in, open your mind, and let's walk this path together. This is the PIR Integration Radio. And today, it gives me great pleasure to introduce David, who's come to share his experience, strengths, and hope with us. Hello, David. Thank you very much for coming. How are you
Hi,
today?
thanks for having me. I'm fabulous. Thank you.
Good. So to get us started, would you please tell us a little bit about yourself and how you found yourself in recovery first before we talk about PIR?
Sure. I am in my mid-60s. I've been married. It'll be 38 years come next summer. About 18 years ago, I experienced what I call a bottom in Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. Didn't call it that in those days. Basically, something came up. My wife and I went into counseling together. The counselor suggested that I go to Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, and I've been there ever since. I found that stopping my bottom line behaviors was pretty easy because I recognized at that time that my marriage was in danger. But it took me still a couple of years to get comfortable with myself and really begin to absorb the idea of recovery. Then it took a couple of more years for me to repair my marriage, which I couldn't do until I was in shape to do that. And since then, close to 2 decades has passed, and it's working. My wife and I have a wonderful relationship. Acting out has long since ceased to be an issue for me. I've been enjoying it for the first 10, 15 years of my recovery. I was on what I call a 3-meeting-a-week diet. There were 3 meetings not far from my home that I attended on a regular basis. When the pandemic hit in 2020, 2 of those meetings went to phone meetings, and I continued to participate. One of them just kind of took a hiatus. And then during that period, I tripped over PIR. And so I started attending meetings. Again, I mentioned my home fellowship is SLAA. I've never been a part of AA or NA. I do consume alcohol and cannabis, et cetera. And that has not been an issue for me over my life. I came into PIR. I did have some previous psychedelic experience. I saw the Grateful Dead more than once in the 1980s. Uh, so, a variety of psychedelics there. When I had children, um, I decided at that point to stop doing psychedelics because I just didn't really trust myself entirely. And I laid off psychedelics until my kids were adults. And I was at a music festival with my son, and my son had found psychedelics and he shared with me. And so that was like in maybe the late teens, before I came back, before I found PIR. So I had some experience recreationally with psychedelics, but I also, from that experience, knew that I couldn't I couldn't use psychedelics without learning something every single. There was always something that, even, if I'm at a concert and I'm just dancing, there's always at least some moment in there where I'm, it's all connected. The sense of unity would come to me. And so, that's why I thought PIR would an interesting place to be. In my time in PIR, it's been like 4 years now. I would say that I'm not a frequent psychedelic user at all. I mean, maybe few times a year. I would say that the majority of my psychedelic use has continued to be recreational. But I have had 3 different journeys that were therapeutic, whether intentionally or not. I did one where I used my psychologist my therapist as a sitter, which, you know, she wasn't all that skilled at. So I don't think I got everything I could have out of that. I did another one where I I followed the protocols that I've learned in PIR, set myself a quiet space, put the eye shades on, put some wordless music on. I was alone, but I did have my son, who lives 10 minutes from here, on alert that if I needed help, he was my support. This summer, I actually had an experience where I was with a group of friends, and one of them had what he perceived to be a near-death experience while we were using mushrooms. In the end, it turned out to be mostly dehydration, but we didn't know it at the time, and we were camping out in the boonies. We weren't taking any risks. I called 911 on the guy, but I went through this experience with this dear friend of mine who honestly believed he was dying, and that was pretty profound for me as well. I actually found with that experience, uh, once once I had him in the hands of the paramedics, I had a complete breakdown, curled up, fetal position, wailing. Over the course of that experience, a lot of grief that I hadn't been able to get rid of. I've lost both my parents in the past 5 years, and really wasn't able to get that good cry I might have hoped for during those experiences. Well, I got that good cry. I really just had this profound grief, and it was very healing for me. So that is kind of my experience. At this point, I still regularly attend one of my 3 local meetings. I attend one other SLAA meeting online, and then I attend a bunch of PIR meetings. I typically hit a meeting, 5, 6 times a week. A lot of that is simply because, hey, it's convenient. It's right here. In the US, it might be 7 or 8 in the evening. Well, my choice is I can turn on the television or I can get on a meeting. It's a pretty easy choice for me because the meetings both have value and are just a really nice place to be. The kind of human contact and interaction we have in the meetings is just really positive and supportive. And I get a lot out of it, even though it's been, well over a decade since I've had any issues around the actual addiction that brought me.
Yes. And there is also a PIR/SLA meeting in your
Which is
time
one of
frame.
which I attend on the regular.
Yeah, that's one of the fabulous thing of PIR is that within the same fellowship we can
Hmm.
address
Right.
adult children issues, childhood trauma,
Yeah.
internal
Absolutely.
family
The
system, and
The ACA stuff definitely was real interesting for me. I ended up getting, I think if they call it the Big Red Book, the
Mhm.
ACA book, and read through quite a bit of that. I also attended the CODA themed meeting and quickly discovered that codependency is not my issue. But Yeah, certainly I have family stuff and ACA in particular because of the more formal trauma acknowledgement in that program, which we see a lot of in PIR, but in there it's really central to understand what traumas, to being trauma informed. What I know about my own sexual acting out was that I had an experience as a child, 50 years ago, where my parents punished me in a way that was, in those days, considered good, strict parenting, and today would be considered child abuse. And I had a lot of confusion and humiliation around it, which I swallowed, and they came back up in a sexualized form, and that has been the driver of my sexual addiction this whole time. The fact that that was a way I could relieve, another issue. I've long understood that the sexual acting out is not the cause of my problems; it's a symptom of my problems. And yeah, I could stop the acting out and never resolve the problems underlying it. I know a number of people who are sober in the sense that they don't drink alcohol, but not in recovery in any way, shape, or form. And so for me, recovery has become much broader than dealing with the issues that brought me into the rooms in the first place. I mean, my recovery goals now is I'm going to try to be a little less of an asshole today than I was yesterday. And if I have to be an asshole, I'm going to try to aim it at people where it's not going to hurt anybody. I have close friends, right? The guy I mentioned who I had that adventure with this summer, and those guys, you know, I can be an asshole to them in a kind of friendly way and get it out of my system, so I don't bring it home to my wife or my kids or my siblings or whatever.
And how did you come to the realization that your sexual acting out was directly stemming from a childhood trauma? At what point in your recovery? Was that through therapy? Was that through intentional
Yeah,
or not use of psychedelics, or combo?
that was prime. It was primarily through therapy when I first came into the program, into SLAA, 18 years ago. I connected with a psychiatrist who actually did a fair amount of publishing on sexual issues and had a whole practice around marital and sexual health. And he was the one who really, and during the time I worked with him, it wasn't a 15-minute medications meeting, appointment. It was an hour of therapy, and he was very Freudian, which, you know, parts of it okay, parts of it not, but whatever. But he was the one who just really made it clear to me that this fantasy that I was projecting onto others was really about me. And that was, pretty early on. That was my first couple of years, and I think that's part of what helped me do the healing of myself that I needed to do as a necessary first step before I could really repair myself.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a criticism of a lot of conventional 12-step program, is they are not trauma aware or trauma informed, and that a lot of the trauma is glossed over and ignored. And that's why I think incorporating meetings with the ACA program or internal family system within the PIR fellowship is been very informative for a lot of people who discovered and acknowledged their trauma almost for the first time in their recovery when they landed in PIR. And people like me, after years in AA, who did AA, PIR, and ACA. And PIR was the gateway to ACA, where the root cause of my issue and my trauma is. I think this is something that Gabor Mate talks a lot about. He said, "Don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain."
Right. I actually heard, I was listening to a podcast this past week, a Ram Dass lecture, and he talked about subsystems in the context of before he had used psilocybin when he was still a professor at Harvard. He had this really good scientific understanding of humans. He was a professor of psychology. One of the first things that he learned, I think, from psychedelics was that all this stuff that I knew coming in here, it's not that it isn't true, it's that it's a subsystem of a greater reality. And I found that to be a really helpful concept. So, for example, if we look at traditional AA, today, AA is a subsystem of a broader recovery movement.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But when AA developed, it was a pretty single minded organization. Hey, stop drinking, right? It was very clear, if you're in AA, it's obvious if you're drinking or not. In more process addictions, whether it be sex or food, it's a different system that, for example, in PIR, we talk about the fact that we have to, choose our own bottom lines.
Mm-hmm.
That's true in SLAA. One of the first things you have to do is figure out what your bottom lines are. Now, there are other S fellowships. SA, for example, Sexaholics Anonymous is different. They won't tell you to figure out your own bottom line. They'll tell you, hey, your bottom line is no sex outside of marriage, even with yourself, full stop. And for some people, including a sponsee of mine in SLA, turned out that was a much better program for him because that fit in with his worldview, his religion, and that's what was good for him. Whereas for me, my longtime joke is if God hadn't wanted us to masturbate, he wouldn't have made our arms this long. So, I do believe that those kinds of activities can be handled in a healthy adult way. The idea of the only possible choice is complete abstinence simply isn't true. And same thing with food. You can't abstain from food. And so, this idea that it's a much more thoughtful process, I think helps in getting to what's underneath it.
Mm-hmm.
In a way that traditional AA just wasn't built to do. I mean, it's not a slam on them. That wasn't their job. Their job was to help people stop drinking. And, it's effective for people for that. But, I hear a lot of people in PIR saying, yeah, I stopped drinking, but I was still miserable. And, it takes something beyond that, whether it's a PIR or an AC or some other kind of broader look. So you don't just look at the subsystem of, am I not drinking? For me, it's like my subsystem is, am I not acting out my bottom lines? Well, yes. And then am I really am I in recovery? I can stop acting out and not be in recovery. Working on my recovery is a separate thing. I haven't acted out in years, but I still have to work on my recovery every day. The idea of being able to recognize views of reality that we carry as subsets of actual reality is something that just fits really well with the use of psychedelics in a therapeutic way. Because if there's one thing psychedelics are going to show you, it's that, oh no, you don't really understand it.
Yeah, clearly. And so what does recovery look like for you today, 18 years after your first meeting? And what's your practice?
So obviously I'm not acting out on my bottom lines.
Mm-hmm.
I have what I call the committee when it comes to my bottom lines. The committee includes my sponsor, my therapist, my psychiatrist, and my wife. And so if I want to change my bottom lines, I have to talk to those 4 people. And if all 4 of those people think that the change I'm recommending is a realistic, is an appropriate change, okay. If not, no. So as an example, I had set some specific limits around masturbation that I was holding to. And then about 8 years ago already, my father, who was then in his 90s, was no longer able to live independently. And so I took him into my home. And my father and I we had our issues because fathers and sons.
Mm-hmm.
And I immediately went to the committee and said, hey, this standard that I've set for myself, that's not tenable right now. The stress, I'm going to cut myself a little bit of slack because I'm dealing with a much more stressful situation now. Right. And then once my father, moved out of my house into assisted living and then ultimately passed, I've been working back to where I was before that. Right. Now, to make my bottom lines tighter, I don't need to get that approved. Right. If I want to, be a little more serious, I can do that on my own. But if I want to loosen something, it's got to go through the committee. Because one of the things I know about myself is that, well, I'm pretty scrupulously honest with other people. I lie to myself all the time. And I just can't be trusted for that kind of stuff. And so I surround myself by people I can trust. I have 3 adult children, and every one of them feels free to tell me when I'm being an idiot, right? The classic example, when my son was still a teenager, we'd have a conversation that would go something like this. He'd say, "Dad, why are you yelling?" And I'd respond, "I'm not yelling." And then I'd say, "Oh, give me a couple minutes," right? Because it was obvious to him long before it was obvious to me, right? I'm getting heated up inside and I'm not aware of it at all until it's pointed out to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so surrounding myself by people who feel free to tell me when I'm being that asshole is, building that kind of community around myself is a large part of what I consider my recovery. I do go to a bunch of meetings. It's as much for the social engagement and just the positive vibes. Although, if I leave a meeting and I haven't learned something, that's on me. There's always something you can learn in a meeting. You might have to dig for it a little bit, but there's always something you can learn. And so, it's part of my continuing education. I do, as I mentioned, I'm in therapy. I have a psychiatrist. I do read pretty widely. Anything that I come across that looks like it might be of interest, and pertinent, my local library is fabulous. I'll type in the book I want, and a week later I'll get an email saying, "Come get it." And so that to me is most of my recovery is building a community around myself that will prevent me from making the kinds of mistakes that I'm really susceptible to.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. I like the notion of the committee. I haven't phrased it like this myself, but I do. I was sharing in a meeting yesterday. I now do not make any decisions until I've spoken to my therapist, my sponsor, and I've consulted the I Ching if it's really important to because that arrogant me that used to think she knew everything
Mm-hmm.
is no longer. Or I know that if she's back in the driving seat, it's danger.
Education is the progressive discovery of your own ignorance.
Absolutely. Very well said. This is
Not
this.
original.
And what's your relationship with higher power? Because presumably you've worked a 12-step in SLA,
Uh,
and there is that notion of higher power there too.
okay. All right. So let me first tell you about my experience specifically working the steps, and then I'll talk about higher power. In SLAA, I got as far as step 6, where, asking God to get rid of our defects of character,
Mm-hmm.
and couldn't buy it. I firmly believe that my defects of character are part of what makes me me. Right? I would not be myself if I didn't have my quirks and faults and whatever. And I just got stuck on that and I never moved past it until I came to PIR. And in PIR, the 6th step reads, have our higher power remove, all these characteristics that cause suffering. That I can get behind, right? So that's when I finally got past the 6th step was, a dozen years into recovery when I came across it framed up the way we do in PIR. And what I've noticed since then is that as I look at the rest of the steps, I've worked those steps, not formally, but I've included all those things in the work that I do. In terms of higher power, I'm Jewish. Okay. I'm very lucky that I grew up in the kind of Jewish home where my father would quote this one rabbi who would say, "You can question anything you want as long as you question out of love." Right? And there's no dogma to be had.
Mm-hmm.
Everything can be questioned. Judaism as a religion is a lot of questioning, a lot of arguing, a lot of disagreements. If you study Talmud, you'll find that everything that's recorded there, well, this rabbi said this and this rabbi said that, and then they discussed it, and this is how we came out. But there's always alternative viewpoints. So there's very little dogma. There was very little sexual shame in my upbringing. I have friends in program who grew up Catholic in particular, where that's just a major issue because of how they were raised that way. So I've always had a connection to my higher power through my religious upbringing, and my first experiences with psychedelics only confirmed everything I already believed. Coming into program, it took me a little bit of time. If you come into a 12-step program, and you are not Christian, it is pretty obvious the Christian roots of some of the ideas. And it functions in ways that I just disagree with. And so it took me a little while to recognize the universality of the ideas in the 12-step world, even if some of the specific prayers and whatnot are tied to a particular religion that I've no particular interest, no interest in. So, that's where I am. My education is in science, right? I've studied physics. If you get into, the really weird subatomic stuff, there's a lot of things that, the whole idea of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle is, it's not that there are things we don't know, it's that there's things we cannot know. And I think there's plenty of room for God in there. That's kind of one of my visions of, how I understand God. Another is the idea of, I used to do a lot of bicycling when I was younger. Okay. And, you can be on a flat road and there's a difference between going into a headwind and going with a tailwind. Right. And if you're aligned, now in quotes, with God's will, that's a tailwind, not a headwind. And so, and I also think about it in terms of magnetism, but I'm not going to get into the science of that. But, the idea that, hey, when I'm in line with what I believe my higher power wants for me, things are going to go right. And when I'm not, they won't. Now that I don't believe in turning my will over to God. I believe God expects a partnership out of me, right? There's no, God will do it all. No. God will give me the tools to do it all if I ask nicely and appropriately and I work at it. But it's not something that, the two sets of footsteps in the sand and then there's only one. No, there's always two sets of footsteps, because, in my mind, at this point in human history, my understanding of God is that God works through humans. And I've seen enough examples of that in my life to be comfortable with that.
Yeah. I understand your perception coming from Judaism and getting into a 12-step fellowship, which was rooted in the Oxford group, really, and that big book. But I think taking a bit of perspective through PIR and looking more at the 12 spiritual principles that underpin those steps. And then now I realize how universal they are. But in practice, from the St. Francis prayer to some of the practice of the steps looks a lot like a Catholic confession at some point. And that's also coming from a very strict Catholic background, is something that completely put me off when I first arrived in AA, because I thought I had divorced that religion. And years later, I'm having to take it back. And I had a huge amount of resistance towards this as well. And like you, I think psychedelics experience have really helped me just realize it's irrelevant. All this is irrelevant. It's dogma. It's semantic. I need to rise above it and understand the core principle behind it.
So I remember a time in SLAA where someone was giving their lead, and made several references to the scripture. And the first one I noticed, and the second one annoyed me a little bit. And the third one, I'm like, all right, if this comes up again, I'm raising my hand. And the next time he used the word, I raised my hand and said, I'm sorry. I say, you keep referring to scripture. And while I understand you mean no harm about it, you're referring to a religious text of a particular religion that not everybody in this room shares. And he was all flustered and he was ready to argue with me. And I'm like, group conscience, we'll talk about it after. Between then and when we actually had the group conscience, he's like, okay, I get your point. But we had the group conscious meeting, and half a dozen other people in the room were like, oh, thank God somebody said something. It was making me crazy. So much of my issue is around my religious upbringing, And so the universality, I think, is really actually a pretty important part of it. I won't hide the fact that I'm Jewish. I won't hide the fact that impacts my thinking and my actions. But I also don't expect anybody who's not me to understand that. Right. There's parts where it's like, hey, I'll mention things, but it's not, I understand they're not universal.
Yeah, fair comment. And going back to your psychedelic experiences, mostly in recovery, although they were recreational, and not necessarily intentional, except maybe the one you did with your therapist. Can you describe how they impacted you in your recovery, or the part of you that is working on your recovery? How it's been helpful or not?
The most consistent theme that I've had throughout those experiences is there's two parts of it. One is this kind of unity of existence, the fact that everything is interrelated. And the other is this real comfort in my understanding that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. There have been, like I said, I'm in my 60s. As a younger man, and certainly as a kid, I was frequently afraid that I was doing something wrong. I wasn't taking the right approach. I was, all those kinds of things. And, I get a little psilocybin in me. I get a little acid in me. And it's like, oh no, I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. And I can be comfortable in the world and in my role in it. And that means keeping my perspectives open. I'll give you a little Jewish something. There's an old Hasidic story about this village, this little shtetl in Europe 100 years ago. And there was this one very wise rabbi who everybody went to for advice. And he always had the right thing to say. And what people noticed when he was walking around during the day, every so often he'd stop and get kind of a confused look on his face. And sometimes he'd pull a piece of paper out of his left pocket, and he'd look at it, and he'd nod his head and smile, and then he'd go about his business. And sometimes he'd reach into his right pocket, pull out a different piece of paper and smile, and nod his head, go about his business. And finally, someone said to him, "No, Rabbi, tell me, what's written on those pieces of paper that you seem to look at in times of trouble?" He goes, "Oh, I've a couple of biblical verses that I like to refer to. This one is, all of creation is for your benefit. And in the other pocket is, you are nothing but dust. And depending on the situation, I need to look at one or the other to get my head straight."
Yeah. That's too been my experience. Particularly, my most powerful experience was actually without any psychedelics. It was a holotropic breathwork session where I came back with that absolute, it's not even a belief, that knowledge, that absolute knowledge that everything is going to be fine. Don't worry about a thing. And I was trying to share that with people. And the expression "don't worry about a thing" seems so trivial, but yet it was so profound. That notion that everything, I'm looked after, everything is exactly as it should be, and there's nothing to worry about. When I spend 90% of my day worrying about stuff, very trivial stuff, but it takes so much of my brain and my time that could be allocated to better stuff, of course. And that stayed with me for a while, a few weeks. And then, of course, life got in the way and I forget. I should put that in my pocket, actually. Take a leaf out of the rabbi's book.
Yeah.
Put that in my
And
right pocket.
what I find is that, I totally agree with that idea of this, the knowledge that things are okay. And sometimes when I've been away from that stuff for a while and that feels far away, it's enough to remember that I know that. I may not feel like I know it right now, but I can remember that I know it. And, and that can sometimes get you over the hump of whatever challenge you're facing.
Yeah, it's remembering to remember.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing. Life gets in the way and we can get caught up. And that's why I wear this on my finger. Remember to pause. And it's in that pause that I can take time to remember and to be guided.
In my office on the monitor is a yellow Post-it note that says, "Pause, think." Because my problem traditionally has been I say what I think without thinking.
Yeah. Impulse control. That is something that a lot of addicts share a lack of impulse control.
Right. I was diagnosed as being ADD in my late 30s. Okay. Growing up, I was lazy and I was not living up to my potential, and it was a character flaw. And it was only pretty deep into adulthood that I realized, oh no, that's not a character flaw. That's just my neurology. That's just how I'm wired, and it requires me to be aware of it Okay. And it also requires me to, for example, I talked about how my family feels really good about pushing back on me if I'm out of line. The other thing my family knows is that I'm frequently oblivious. I could be sitting in the room with you while you're having a conversation, and I'm not hearing any of it because I'm reading a book or I'm thinking of something else or I'm just elsewhere. And, that obliviousness, on the one hand, sometimes it causes trouble. On the other hand, that's just how I am. I can't change it. And it's important. What I told my kids when they were growing up is if you tell me something and you didn't see me write it down, you didn't tell me.
Yeah. I share that trait too. I always carry a notepad. I was too diagnosed later in my adulthood with ADHD, and interestingly, the simple fact of writing it down is sufficient for me to remember it. I never have to look back to what I've written. But if I don't
I have to
write
go back
it,
to what I've written.
rarely do I. Rarely do I.
Mhm.
The fact of writing it down
Oh,
imprints
yeah.
it in my memory.
That's absolutely true. I mean, that the neurology makes sense.
Yeah, it's and acceptance is the answer to all my problems. And I
Mhm.
too have accepted this. I tried ADHD medication, and 10 days I lasted, and it made me into a complete asshole. And I thought I haven't worked on my recovery to be a better version of myself, for that to be taken away by some pills I have to take every day to comply to a system I do not want to belong to in the first place.
Whereas I was the guy where they could give me like Benzedrine, like straight up crank, and I would take a nap because
Right.
I'm not neurotypical. That doesn't affect me that way. When I was actually being diagnosed for ADD, the psychiatrist, it's like, tell me about your drug history. I'm like, oh, well, and I started talking about the various things I had done in college and whatnot. And, I've tried a bunch of different things. And as I'm going through the list, you can see the smile forming, and I stopped. He goes, no cocaine? And I said, OPC, other people's Coke. If somebody offered me a line, I would take it. But it's not something I'm going to chase on my own. He goes, yeah, because you're ADD. It really doesn't do anything.
Hmm.
And so, yeah. And I do think that I also have studied attention issues enough to understand that what we call ADD or ADHD actually covers a wide range of neurological issues. Some are attention related, some are memory related. There's all kinds of different pieces, parts under that umbrella. So everyone who's ADD or ADHD is not necessarily the same. Much in the same way that, as I say in SLA, we're not all, abstaining from the same thing, right? There are things that one person can do and it's just not an issue at all that would send another person spiraling and vice versa.
Yeah, no, it's a complex neurological condition, and I do not like the label, especially considering it consists of the word disorder. I don't believe it's a disorder. I believe it's a type, and but that's a topic of a different
Right.
conversation.
Well, I mean, labels in general. There is a quote from a book on physics that I read once that says, to perceive something is to give up other ways of understanding.
Yeah, true.
And that's kind of what we're dealing with is whatever if we're looking at it this way, we can't be looking at it that way. And learning to reframe things. If I look at the work I do with sponsees, a large majority of it is simply reframing. They'll say, I completely fucked up yesterday. I'm like, oh, so you had a slight slip. It's like, well, let's not, because all of us, I think, who have found the rooms, engage in negative self-talk. And I say this to my sponsees. I say, listen, I said, I try to be very non-judgmental, very accepting of their stuff, but not my own. I would not I say to my sponsees, my goal in life is to speak to myself the way I speak to my sponsees, right? Because if anyone else spoke to somebody I love the way I speak to myself, we would have a problem, right? Yet that's how I speak to myself, and that's a work in progress. I'm better at it than I was before, and hopefully not as good as I'm going to be later.
Yes, progress, not perfection. And talking of which, one of the last questions I would like to ask you, we usually finish with this, is what are you still struggling with, or what do you find a challenge in your recovery today?
Find a challenge. The same thing that makes, like I said, I attend, half a dozen meetings a week. The majority of them are on Zoom. And Zoom is great because I don't have to put pants on, right? I don't have to go outside. Where I live in the winter, it's shitty out. I don't have to go anywhere. On the other hand, the fact that it's online and it's in my house means I'm extremely susceptible to distraction. And so if I'm not working really hard to stay fully present at a meeting, I'll find myself wandering off in my own head. And that is, that's just a waste of time. Why am I on the meeting if I'm not paying attention? I think that, that's kind of, and I can apply that not just to meetings, but to life. If I'm not paying attention to the important things around me, what the people I care about need, what, I'm lucky enough to own a home. You know what? A home requires maintenance, right? I need to stay on top of that stuff or my home is going to go away. I mean, that's just how, it's a 75-year-old building. And the idea of learning what to be paying attention to in the moment, I think is kind of an ongoing thing. The flip side is I'm really happy where my recovery is. There's no question in my mind that I would not still be married if I hadn't found recovery. Okay. I would not have been as good a parent had I not found recovery. And, I'm at a point in my life where, I parented my kids. They're all adults. They all successfully launched. And like I said, in his 90s, I took my father in for a number of years into my home and made a very conscious decision that I wasn't going to parent him the way he parented me. I was going to parent him the way I wanted to be parented.
Mm-hmm.
And it was extremely healing. I did that with both my, just, when my parents passed on, we were just 100% good in a way that 10 or 15 years ago, I wouldn't have thought possible. And, so the final challenge, the final boss in this is how can I parent David? Right? How can I treat myself in the way that, a loving parent would treat me? And I'm way better at it than I used to be, but there's still those voices of negativity, those voices of judgment are still in there. Not quite as loud as they used to be, not quite as prevalent as they used to be, but they're still there, and it's still something I need to be working.
Right. Yes. Thank you very much for your honest answer. And that, I think, brings us to the end of this beautiful conversation. We've got a couple more minutes before we close. Is there anything that you wish I'd asked you, or any words of wisdom you want to share with us before we close?
The words of wisdom are keep coming back. It works if you work it, and it won't if you don't. So work it because you're worth it. I've had such a positive experience through my recovery, both in SLAA and in PIR, and it has made me really a much better human. One thing I will say about 12-step work in general, and I learned this again because my original recovery was around sexuality, which a lot of people have a lot of hangups over, just like psychedelics, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when people talk about, gee, how do I talk about this with my AA friends? I'm like, well, you might want to consider the fact that your AA friends have the right not to know. So, for example, I have a sister who I have brought up 12-step as a way to deal with some of her issues many times, to the point where one day she stopped me. She goes, all right. She goes, you keep talking about 12-step recovery, but I know you drink. I know you smoke weed. What are you recovering from? And I said, well, I've got some issues around relationships, and the particular fellowship that I'm involved in is called Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, because some of those have taken a sexual form. And now I'm going to stop and I'm going to tell you, my dear sister, that you can ask me absolutely anything you want about this, but do not ask questions that you don't want to know the answer to.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because people have the right not to know. And she's never asked me again. Right? I feel that I was honest. We learn the difference between secrecy and privacy.
Yes.
Secrecy is deadly. Privacy is necessary. There are things that I do that I don't necessarily do in front of my wife. It's not that she doesn't know I do these things. It's not that I'm not honest with her. It's that I know she'd rather not see it. Okay, she's entitled to that. If she walks into my office and I'm on the computer, I'm online somewhere, she can look at anything I've got going on. You want my passwords to every site? You can have it. I'm not saying anything to other people that I wouldn't say to those people in front of my wife.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of one of the things that's made it work. The understanding that I'm entitled to privacy, but secrecy will hurt.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a beautiful words of wisdom to close. And I love the parallel you made between talking about sex and talking about psychedelics. Those two are taboo, almost.
Mm-hmm.
People
Not
are,
almost. They're taboo. They're
yes.
Absolutely taboo in society.
And yes, and we in PIR can talk about those freely. That's one of the many beauties of PIR is no outside issues. Of course, pick your crowd, pick your moment, but this is something that can be discussed. There's nothing that cannot be discussed, apart from politics, maybe.
Yeah, I will say that early in my PIR recovery, I did make the mistake of sharing in a PIR meeting in a way that would have been appropriate in an SLAA meeting, but actually wasn't appropriate in the meeting I was in. And it took me a little while to reset where are the taboos in this room. Much in the same way that in my SLAA rooms, I don't frequently talk about psychedelics, right? It's not that anyone there doesn't know, because look at me, I'm an aging hippie, and people know. And I have mentioned it to people who I've known in the rooms for a while. But I don't bring it up if there's new people in the room. I don't bring it up if there's people I don't know in the room, because they're entitled not to know. Because it's a taboo subject, that might make it harder for them. Why would I do that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And for the listeners, David is on my phone as tie-dye David, and he's wearing a tie-dye T-shirt today.
And there's a reasonable chance in all the times you've seen me, you've never seen me in anything but tie-dye T-shirts, because that's mostly what I wear.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much for your time today, David. It was
thank you.
A brilliant conversation, and I look forward to seeing you soon on Zoom.
Likewise.
See you soon.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Psychedelics in Recovery is a peer-led fellowship guided by anonymity, non-endorsement, and mutual respect. Thank you for listening and for placing principles before personalities.